Yggdrasir was the first entity in the first world, but even he had no idea how he was created or where he came from. Plagued by these questions, he created world after world, but each one only led to further mysteries and more unanswered questions. Driven half-mad, he created the sleepers and put them to sleep in the Elysian world, convinced that if he gave them enough time to dream of reality, they would come up with an answer to the question of existence. He would eventually know everything, even if he had to wait for a long time. Those thoughtful giants might have to sleep for eons, but the one thing Yggdrasir had on his side was time, and he was willing to wait. Admiring his creation, Yggdrasir strolled through the Elysian world as the sun set. A breeze whispered across the fields and the flowers nodded their heads as though they were struggling to stay awake too. "No, that isn't it," thought Yggdrasir. "They are agreeing with me. They are telling me that my plan is the right one, and I will not have to scrabble about in the dirt, lost in ignorance like a lower being, forever. When the sleepers wake I will know everything, and at last, I will experience peace." As he walked, he became aware of the sheer scale of the sleepers, true giants whose snores rumbled beneath his feet like brewing earthquakes. The inrush of sleep was so sudden that some of them were passed out in the meadow, face down amongst the flowers. Others reclined against mountains or cliff sides, some had collapsed onto tables and one or two even onto trees, flattening the woodland beneath them. "Sleep," said Yggdrasir, smiling for the first time that he could remember. "Sleep and dream, because in dreams you will find a purer type of truth." The breeze gave one final exhalation, whipping Yggdrasir's long cloak around his body and rocking the flowers, and then ceased altogether. The sun ducked behind the horizon and the Elysian world was plunged into darkness. Morning would come again, but the night would be long for the sleepers. Yggdrasir cast one final look across his creation, his great project, and turned away. With reality running of its own accord, there was no need for Yggdrasir to create more worlds, they created themselves, along with creatures and people and histories and sprawling lives and finally a station between worlds that strung everything together into a coherent whole. All the while, the sleepers slept and dreamed, showing no signs of waking. Time went by and many worlds changed, others were born, some ceased to be, there were wars, great conquests, cataclysms and an infinite number of love stories, stories of loss, first meetings, last meetings and many more besides, but the Elysian world never altered. It remained undiscovered for a long time, but as the web of multiverse travel expanded, so too increased the number of travelers. Humanity's innate desire to discover and categorize, to understand, compelled it towards ever greater feats of exploration. Worlds that teetered on the fringe of imagination were discovered, mapped and studied, so it was only a matter of time until curious feet stepped into the Elysian world. The first travelers were naturally stunned at the sight of the sleepers reclining in the flower meadow. They expected the giants to wake up at any moment, but nothing would stir them. The breeze that once agitated Yggdrasir's cloak now whispered into the ears of the travelers. They had no way to decipher the secrets on the breeze, but they sensed that something, some important and even profound mystery, lurked at the heart of this strange world. Over time, their fear of the sleepers diminished and then vanished, and they tried various methods to wake them. Nothing could disrupt their dreaming slumber, of course, but the spectacle drew all kinds of eyes from all kinds of worlds, culminating in the cult of the enlightened vigilance. The cult built temples and worshipped in the meadow, convinced that the sleepers were about to wake at any moment, gifting complete understanding and transcendence to their followers. Vigilant temples glittered under the endless sunshine, but no matter what rituals and strange prayers the cultists whispered, the sleepers would not stir. Devotees formulated all manner of unusual rituals, striving to reach through their dreams into the dreams of the sleepers. Some even claimed success and recorded their visions in gigantic tomes that became holy books, cherished and preserved inside their temples. Years of study, prayer and ritual culminated in the rise to prominence of Osius. He wandered into the enlightened vigilance with little warning and climbed quickly through the ranks. At first, he was subservient and always obeyed the higher-ranking priests, but as his influence grew, so too did his rhetoric. He began to question the teachings of the elders and even the received wisdom of previous members. He combed through the holy texts and cursed their limitations, finding gaps in knowledge, contradictions and long-outdated dogma. Osius made more and more speeches that criticized the old ways. These diatribes resonated with the younger devotees and even some of the older members, although they would never admit it. After all, the enlightened vigilance had been operating for centuries, always on the verge of a transcendence that never came. Nobody spoke outwardly of their impatience or dissatisfaction, but these things were whispered, and so Osius's popularity grew as he promised a departure from the old ways of blind obedience and faith. He even encouraged the vigilant to question, why did the sleepers continue in their slumber? Was their sleep some kind of punishment? Questions buzzed upon the air in those days, and although Osius couldn't answer them, simply by letting the devotees voice their grievances, his name was celebrated. Rivals and elders resented him, but it wasn't long before he was the most revered member of the Vigilant, a reformer, no less, a hero in some quarters. It was inevitable that he would eventually take matters too far. "We are the chosen ones," he declared. "The sleepers reached out to me inside a dream. They told me that we are the ones to wake them. We are the anointed few. We will receive their wisdom and transcend." At first, the Vigilant was skeptical. Many of the older priests declared it blasphemy to even consider intervening and waking the sleepers deliberately. Osius was excommunicated and banned from the temples, but nobody could force him to leave the Elysian world altogether. He set up his own temple in the meadows and continued to preach, telling everybody that the sleepers were speaking to him, that the time had come to wake them, that he was the chosen one, and that everybody who followed him would be rewarded. It didn't take long. Osius was declared a prophet and invited back into the order, and the older Vigilant priests were the ones who found themselves excommunicated. He set about fulfilling what he, and everybody else, considered his destiny. The Vigilant resolved to take matters into their own hands, daring to disturb their gods and force the divinity out of them. A complex ritual of lights, sounds, mysterious prayers and even more mysterious sacrifices was established, and a date was set to rouse the sleepers. In preparation, the devotees barricaded themselves inside their temples, fasting and dreaming and purifying, ready to receive the long-promised transcendence. Tension hummed through the air with palpable energy. Clad in new, shining robes, Osius led the way on the ritual day, erecting a dramatic altar in the middle of the Elysian world. A light breeze stirred his robes, stirred the robes of all the vigilants gathered before him, threatening to dislodge their hoods. Speaking in dramatic tones and accompanied by much fanfare, Osius commenced the ritual. Nothing happened. The sleepers remained asleep. Perhaps the ritual was not performed correctly. They tried again, and then many more times. Nothing. The sleepers remained asleep. The next day there was no sign of Osius, although rumors circulated that he had fled to the station between worlds in the middle of the night. What can be done after such a crushing failure, such a disappointment? Osius's followers deserted, and so did many of the newer vigilants. Others claimed that the disaster was a test of faith, that the sleepers were closer than ever to waking, and that they would reward the faithful who stayed, but nothing happened. The sleepers slept and there was nothing that anybody or anything could do to wake them. In time, the enlightened vigilance faltered and faded as the devotees lost faith, and even cursed their ancestors for starting the whole charade in the first place. The temples crumbled to dust but the winds swayed the flowers, the sun beat down and the sleepers slept, first dismissed as some strange spectacle and then forgotten about altogether. Eventually, somebody stumbled upon them again. They were briefly a bizarre tourist attraction, pulling in visitors from across the worlds as the station between worlds expanded its network. Tourism brought pollution and destruction to the flower meadow but did nothing to wake the sleepers, and interest dwindled again. The tourists stopped buying tickets, the trains stopped visiting and the Elysian world was forgotten about all over again. The flowers grew, the sun shone and the sleepers did what they had done for so long. All the while, Yggdrasir bided his time. He did not return to the flower meadow, no matter how tempted he was to check on his creations. He knew that if he woke them too early, then the whole endeavor would be worthless, an idea that filled him with all manner of horror. Instead, Yggdrasir drifted from place to place in various forms. Sometimes he was an emperor ruling over a whole world or even several worlds, but power was ultimately empty and unsatisfying. At other times he concealed himself as a more anonymous figure, toiling for many generations but finding no peace in his honest labors. In one such guise, Yggdrasir was a fisherman in a peculiar, far-flung world where the sea glowed at night and sometimes even spoke, telling stories that were always sad, as though the ocean had lost somebody dear to it. Of course, Yggdrasir could have used his powers to drag the fish out of the sea. He could have transfigured the fish into solid gold quicker than the blink of an eye, could have transformed that whole world into fish or gold if he wanted to, but he persisted with his early morning trips out of the harbor, and then his late-night visits to the fish market. He maintained a small cottage on a rocky beach. When he wasn't out fishing, he would stroll along that beach, wondering at the peculiar flotsam washed up from faraway worlds. He rose early in the morning when even the sun was still asleep and hidden under the horizon. He threw on his thick coat, his boots, prepared his rods, loaded them onto his boat and then set off across the melancholy sea. In those early hours on the brink of sunrise, the sea would sometimes weep and recite sad poetry. Yggdrasir listened, but was rarely affected. Love, like all things in the worlds, struck him as a purposeless endeavor, completely without meaning or reason. He cast his nets, worked his rods and his crab pots, and returned to the harbor as the sun set. The sea was always at its most mournful in those final hours of the day. Yggdrasir wondered whether it didn't love the sun, and lamented their time apart. By the time the moon rose, always full and often grinning happily, Yggdrasir had delivered his catch to the fishmonger, to be put on ice and sold the following day. Such a life brought routine, and sometimes he even felt as though he belonged in that world with all those mortals, who would live out their days and die without purpose, reason or answers. "Don't you wonder?" he asked the sea one night, as it resonated soft pink, having just concluded another one of its stories. "How you were created and why? The reason for all this? The answers?" "Never," replied the sea mournfully. One day, Yggdrasir found water pooling in the bottom of his boat, and some damage to the hull. He could have repaired this damage in the blink of a thought, but no, you are playing at being a human. He sent for the shipwright and waited as the boat was repaired. Unable to take his usual journeys out to sea, Yggdrasir was left to wander the town. Cobbled streets sloped down towards the coastline, where whitewashed buildings, battered by the waves, eyed the almighty expanse before them. A lighthouse, its light long since extinguished, perched precariously on a clifftop above the harbor entrance. He met her just outside the market, a lone figure who stood out somehow, against the grey murk that often enveloped the seaside town. Their eyes met, hers as blue as sapphire, her hair jet black. She was carrying a doctor's bag and seemed distracted, but she stopped, and they spoke briefly about nothing in particular. Yggdrasir met her again the following day, the day after that, and even the next day. During these meetings, he discovered a number of things. He discovered that Brigid was the town doctor and that she lived in a small cottage towards the top of a hill, overlooking the town and the sea. He discovered that she made house calls every morning, and visited the market on her way back home, at the same time every day. He also discovered that she lingered in the market hoping to bump into him, and he discovered that he had been doing the same thing. Yggdrasir experienced something, he would not call it love, a sensation which he thought of rarely and only as a malady beneath his dignity. Perhaps it was longing, perhaps it was merely a desire for company, but he realized that he wanted to be near her. His trips out to sea became inconveniences, interludes before he could see Brigid again, speak to her and walk beside her through the market, and then along the beach. Sometimes they would sit and talk for hours. Brigid spoke about her life in the town, how the death of her mother inspired her towards medicine, even how she sometimes lay awake at night, struggling and grappling with the knowledge that not everybody could be saved, that sometimes patients were too old, or too unwell, or the treatments simply didn't exist. Yggdrasir listened to it all, and for the first time in his lengthy existence, he enjoyed listening without the prospect of personal advancement. These stories and anecdotes from Brigid's life, which gradually became deeper secrets as the two grew closer, served him no useful purpose whatsoever. They didn't bring him any nearer to understanding or answering his many questions, and nor did they bring the sleepers any nearer to waking. And yet he savored them. Longed for them. For her. To be close to her beneath the moon, which looked down on them with sad eyes, although Yggdrasir couldn't understand why. For his part, Yggdrasir had plenty that he could share, but none that he should. All of time pressed in his ears, the sights and sounds of creation and obliteration and reality and worlds stacked upon worlds hurtled through his thoughts like colliding atoms. But how could he tell her such things? He chose this world deliberately. Its seclusion in the multiverse meant that it didn't have a station, there was no connection to the station between worlds, and therefore the people weren't even aware that they were part of a multiverse. As far as Brigid was concerned, this was it, the universe, the world, all of it. To tell her anything different would reveal the true nature of himself, and Yggdrasir dared not do that because, and for no rational reason that he could think of, he feared losing her. Time went by and those days spent sitting on the beach became days spent living together. Bridget came down from her cottage in the town and lived with Yggdrasir by the sea, the sound of the waves lapping through their dreams. Perhaps this was the closest Yggdrasir ever came to simply existing, without thoughts or questions, and perhaps he even accomplished that feat once or twice. He continued to fish, and Bridget continued to treat her patients, but there was always a distance between them. Yggdrasir held within him so much knowledge that he would never speak, and so much time, more time than any person or any world. Bridget sensed this distance, and she sensed his reluctance. No matter how he tried, Yggdrasir could never quite settle, could never quieten his mind enough to say, "This is life, here and now, this is what it is to exist, you don't need anything else, stop thinking and exist." The townsfolk spoke of marriage and Bridget obviously expected it too. Why not? Marriage and children and family are the natural order of things for natural people. Yggdrasir piloted his little boat further and further out to sea, where the depths yawned beneath him and the waves towered high. The other fishermen warned him not to go that far. "You have somebody at home who loves you, but why should Yggdrasir fear the sea?" His boat was wrecked and sunk on several occasions, but he merely floated above the waves, raised the ship, repaired it and returned to the shore unscathed. Such occurrences served to remind him that he was not like the other townsfolk. He was only playing at life and probably at love, whatever that meant, too. Breakfast in the morning. The crackle of the radio. Her smile. A walk down to the harbor. The scent of the sea. The splendid monotony of routine. Her voice as she returned home early in the evening. The creeping sunset. The newspaper. The wind that swayed the flowers in their herb garden. All of it. It all felt so real, so much like life. Sometimes he dared to believe that love was the reason for existence, its ultimate purpose, but Yggdrasir came to realize that it was all wrong. Somewhere far away, the sleepers slept. They would not wake up for a long time, so he would not know for a long time. The unspoken gap between Yggdrasir and Bridget grew wider and wider. Yggdrasir, invulnerable to harm and with no comprehension of physical pain, experienced a different kind of hurt. An aching tugged at the essence of his being, so profound that it was difficult to resist. He analyzed the sensation endlessly. It was loss, but much more. It was the loss of something that was never truly real, never possible. Perhaps, after all, Yggdrasir did get a bitter taste of what it is to be human. Soon, the gap was so wide that they struggled to see each other across it. One night, when the moon looked sadder than ever before, they strolled side by side along the beach. Their cottage a dimly lit silhouette in the distance, they walked further and further along the shoreline until home was nearly out of sight. "What more do you want?" she asked, watching him carefully. "We have a happy life here with the sea, the beach and the cottage." Yggdrasir felt the weight of existence pressing outwards at the corners of his thoughts, threatening to burst at the seams. He could, he imagined, tell her everything. "I was the first entity in the first world, created apparently from nothing, but that is clearly and obviously impossible. What would you do in such a position? You would wonder, and then the wonder would become a torment. Mortals put their faith in all kinds of things to keep the horror at bay, but how can I believe in your myths? I have seen too much. I simultaneously know enough and not enough. You all have your beliefs, but I have nothing, only questions that cannot be answered." He didn't say any of that, of course. "Meaning," he said instead, and then nothing else. "Meaning?" Her eyes narrowed. "What meaning do any of us have?" "None." "Then why should you be any different?" Yggdrasir didn't answer, but he did feel something. Something resembling pity, although he couldn't work out whether it was for himself, for Bridget or for everybody and everything. More? He felt more. Something like sorrow. Something like wanting to reach out a hand, but knowing that you are unable to. "I think," said Bridget more softly, "that we can make our own meaning in life. We don't need anything like, we don't need anything more. Life is as meaningful as you want to make it." "For you, perhaps," thought Yggdrasir, but he didn't say that either. Instead, he watched the peculiar moon drifting above the waves. It moved of its own accord, bobbing this way and that, sometimes even ducking out of the sky completely, only to reappear a few moments later with a guilty expression. It watched them sadly. Or at least it gave the impression of watching them. More likely than not, Everybody who looked up at the moon felt as though it was personally watching them, and personally cared about their fate, but the moon probably had troubles of its own and wasn't watching anybody.
It's as simple as that, continued Brigid, the lunar light reflecting in her eyes. Find a purpose. I thought it was the sea. Fishing. Fishing is nothing, said Yggdrasir bitterly. It's a waste of existence. Then do something that does. If you want to teach, teach.
The school.
Teaching solves nothing. All it teaches is that we do not know. Medicine then.
Is that your purpose?
Yes. She replied thoughtfully. Helping people. Changing their lives. Saving their lives. I feel like that's what I'm here to do. Your reason for existing. Why not? Curing people. It's something.
But why cure them?
He said before he could stop himself.
They're only going to die anyway. Now her expression altered and Yggdrasir knew that she was lost. That sensation of sorrow, similar in complexion to the rolling depths of the sea, was briefly all-consuming, but Yggdrasir resisted it, attempted to suppress it.
I help them, she said icily. Because life is precious, and I want them to live as best they can, for as long as they can. But why? What difference do a few years make? She turned away, and walked back towards the cottage without him.
Curse her and her ignorance, thought Yggdrasir bitterly, although he didn't mean it and he even suspected, without quite admitting it to himself, that she might be the wiser of them, certainly the more fortunate. Silence settled across the beach, and Yggdrasir was more aware of the sea than ever before.
It did not speak now, and nor did it weep, but he noticed an assortment of peculiar flotsam washing up in the spray at his feet. What are these things? He asked, but even the sea didn't know.
Before he left, Yggdrasir set fire to his fishing boat and set it off, out to sea.
When it was halfway through the bay, heading towards the open ocean, he used his ancient powers to bring it to a halt, so that it burned in full view of the town.
The next morning, he thought, they will find its charred remains washed up on the beach, and then they will understand the nature of their meaningless lives. After that he continued to roam, passing through world after world but never staying for long. He had hoped to find some kind of meaning in that humble existence by the sea, but he could never truly convince himself why he was doing any of it. What is the reason for humbleness, or fishing, or earning a living, or falling in love?
Is there any reason for these things? The only comfort that remained to him was the thought of the sleepers, dreaming of reality and dreaming of all the answers. He entertained other possibilities too, including wealth, fame, success, art, but all of these slid slowly into dust, and left him with an emptiness that burned in the pit of his being like an unanswered question. At times he could feign peace by remembering that the sleepers would give him what he wanted, but there was always so long to wait that he passed most of his existence in various forms of torment. So it was that the sleepers were never far from his mind, even when he was far away from them.
Many eons elapsed before he deemed it safe to wake them.
Enough time had passed. They would know. He was sure, so he returned to the Elysian world.
He found it much as he remembered it, albeit with the ruins of unfamiliar temples scattered across the flower meadows. An old train station, and the half-buried remains of a railway track, were the only evidence that the station between worlds once sold tickets to this place. The hulking forms of the sleepers, passed out in the same positions he had left them in so long ago, stood out against the horizon, strangely angular amongst the flowers.
Yggdrasir required no complex rituals to awaken the sleepers. He simply raised his hand, and the snoring stopped.
Yawning and stretching, groaning and grumbling, the giants opened their eyes. Some of them looked bewildered, others staggered to their feet, stumbling through the flower meadow like newborns, testing out their limbs, but Yggdrasir wasn't inclined to waste any more time. "Well?" he demanded, assembling the giants in the middle of the meadow and standing over them, raised higher than a mountain.
What did you dream?
What is the meaning of existence?
Where did I come from? What is reality?
Yawning deeply, the sleepers told him that they knew the answers, but warned Yggdrasir that he wouldn't like them.
Tell me anyway, he demanded furiously. I have waited long enough. The truth is simple. We dreamed you up in our deep sleep so that somebody would one day wake us.